David lived far from the busy towns. His farm stretched wide across the land, filled with golden fields, broken fences, and quiet barns. He had worked the soil with his hands for years, but the farm was too large for one man, and the days grew harder. He was a quiet soul, carrying loneliness on his shoulders like a heavy sack. His parents were gone, his brothers had moved away, and he had never married. The nights were long, filled only with the sound of crickets and the cold wind that moved through the empty house. One evening, David sat by the dim light of a lantern, staring at the table where unpaid bills lay in a small pile. His harvest had failed again, and the old tractor had broken down. He rubbed his tired face and sighed. He needed help, someone who could work with him, but the townsfolk never came. This far, and no one wanted farm work anymore. Finally, he wrote a simple note. Just a few words on a piece of paper: help wanted, food and shelter provided. He pinned it on the old notice board in the nearby town. He didn't expect much, maybe a drifter or two, someone who could milk cows or fix fences with heavy steps. He returned to the farm, whispering to himself, maybe someone will answer. Days passed and no one came. David kept working alone, his back bending under the weight of chores. Then, one night, when the sky was painted black with stars, something changed. He heard the sound of footsteps on the gravel path, soft but steady. He looked out through the window and froze. 5 figures stood near the gate, their shapes covered in dark cloaks, their faces hidden, their bodies thin. They did not look like farmers. They did not even look like locals. The air grew heavy, and David's heart beat fast. He opened the door slowly. Holding a lantern high, the light fell on their faces, and David almost dropped the lamp. They were not human. Their skin glowed faintly in the night, their eyes large and full of sorrow. Their movements were gentle, almost broken. The tallest among them stepped forward. She pulled back her hood, and her silver hair shone under the lantern light. Her voice was soft, trembling. "We saw your post," she said. "Help wanted, food and shelter." She lowered her eyes as if ashamed. "We have nowhere else to go." David's mind raced. He had heard stories of aliens wandering after wars, abandoned on strange worlds. Some called them cursed, others dangerous. But looking at them now, all he saw was hunger, fear, and exhaustion. They looked like widows, carrying grief heavier than any burden he knew. He hesitated. His farm was all he had. If he let them stay, would danger follow? Yet his heart ached at the sight of their trembling hands and hollow eyes. He could not turn them away. "Come inside," David said at last. His voice was firm, but inside he was shaking. The 5 women entered slowly, their cloaks brushing against the wooden floor. They sat at his long, empty table, like shadows filling an abandoned hall. David placed bread and soup before them. They ate silently at first, their movements careful. Then, faster as hunger pushed them, he noticed the way they glanced at him with both gratitude and fear. After the meal, silence filled the room again. The silver-haired woman looked at him with eyes that carried centuries of pain. "We can work," she whispered. "We can help you." David studied them. Their hands were scarred, their backs bent not from laziness, but from long suffering. He wondered what horrors they had seen, what battles had taken their families. Finally, he nodded. "There is much to do here," he said. "The farm needs many hands." He tried to sound calm, but his heart pounded. He was no longer alone. His farm was no longer silent. That night, David lay awake in his small room, listening to the faint sounds of movement from the barn, where the women slept. Questions spun in his head. Who were they? Where had they come from? Why did fate bring them to his farm? But under the fear, there was something else. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. Perhaps this simple job post, written in loneliness, had opened the door to something far greater. He closed his eyes at last, not knowing that his life And the lives of the 5 widows were about to change forever. Asterisk, the morning sun rose over the farm, painting the fields with soft gold. David walked out of the house with a heavy heart, wondering if the 5 strange women had already left. But when he reached the barn, he found them there, sitting quietly, their cloaks folded neatly. Beside them, their eyes followed him with a mix of fear and hope. He cleared his throat, not knowing what to say. The farm had been empty for so long that even a simple greeting felt strange on his tongue. "Morning," he muttered. His voice sounded rough. Unused to company, the silver-haired woman gave a small nod. The others lowered their heads respectfully. David handed them tools, old and rusted. "If you want to stay," he said slowly, "there's work to be done." He expected them to hesitate to walk away, but instead, they rose at once, silent and ready. It was as if they had been waiting for his words. They moved into the fields with surprising grace. One began clearing weeds with a steady rhythm. Another lifted heavy sacks of grain without complaint. A third repaired a broken fence with skill, while the 4th soothed the nervous animals in the pen. The 5th, smaller and quieter, knelt by the soil, pressing her hands against the earth as though she could hear its heartbeat. David stood watching, his mouth slightly open. They were not like the workers he had imagined. They moved as though every task was sacred, as though every piece of the farm deserved their full care. It was silent work, but the silence was not heavy. It was filled with purpose. At noon, David brought them water and bread. They ate together under the shade of a tree. He noticed how they never reached for food until he did. Their manners were careful, almost ritualistic. He wondered about their past, what rules and customs shaped their lives before they arrived here. Finally, David spoke. "You don't have to stay," he said. His tone was firm, but there was a softness in his eyes. "I only posted a simple job I didn't expect." He trailed off, unsure how to finish. The silver-haired woman placed her cup down and looked at him. Her eyes were deep, carrying pain but also strength. "We have nowhere else," she whispered. Her words trembled like a leaf in the wind. "Our homes are gone, our families. Gone." She lowered her gaze. "If you turn us away, we have nothing left." The others nodded in silent agreement. None of them begged, none of them cried. Instead, they sat with quiet dignity, their hands folded in their laps. It was not a plea, but a truth. David felt his chest tighten. He had known loneliness, but he could not imagine the weight of losing everything. He looked at his farm, at the broken fences, the weary soil, the empty fields. He looked at them, 5 women with eyes full of sorrow, yet still willing to work. Without saying more, he gave a short nod. "Then stay," he said simply. The words came out rough, but they carried weight. The women bowed their heads, a silent agreement forming between them. No contracts, no promises written on paper. Only trust, built on need and survival. David had given them a place, and in return, they would give him their strength. Days passed, and the farm began to change. Weeds disappeared, the fences stood tall again, the animals grew calmer, and the soil seemed to breathe with new life. The widows worked from dawn till dusk, without complaint. They asked for nothing, yet gave everything. At night, David sometimes heard them speaking in their own language. Low whispers that carried both sorrow and comfort he did not understand their words, but he understood the tone. It was the sound of people who had lost, yet still clung to each other. One evening, as he watched them sit together near the barn fire, he felt a strange warmth. For years, the farm had been a place of silence. Now it was alive with quiet voices, soft laughter, and the gentle hum of alien songs. But beneath that warmth, a shadow stirred. David noticed the way they sometimes looked over their shoulders, their eyes scanning the horizon. The silver-haired woman often paused while working, listening to something only she could hear. The youngest widow woke from nightmares. Her cries, muffled but sharp, there was something they had not told him. Something hidden in the silence. David lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. The unspoken agreement was simple: they worked. And he gave them food and shelter, but he knew there was more. A truth waiting in the shadows, and though he did not yet understand it, he could feel it pressing closer. For now, he let the silence remain, but deep in his heart, he knew the peace would not last. The widows had found safety on his farm. But safety was a fragile thing, and sooner or later, someone or something would come looking for them. The days grew longer, and the farm began to breathe again. The sound of tools striking soil and the soft hum of alien voices filled the air. For the first time in years, David's farm looked alive. Yet, behind the progress, he noticed shadows that never left the widow's eyes. Each woman worked with quiet skill. The tall, silver-haired widow, whom David had begun to call Lyra, guided the others with gentle authority. She seemed to know how to repair anything's fences, roofs, even the broken water pump. Another widow, strong and silent, carried heavy logs as if they weighed nothing. The smallest one tended to the animals, whispering in a strange tongue that calmed even the most restless horse. David often stood at a distance, watching, amazed by their hidden talents. It was as though they had been trained for survival, not farm life, and though their hands healed his land, their eyes often looked far beyond the fields, searching for something only they could see. One evening, after the day's work ended, David sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The sky burned red with sunset. Lyra joined him quietly. Her silver hair caught the fading light, making her seem almost unreal. "Your land is strong," she said softly, but broken. Her words carried weight, not as an insult, but as truth. "We will help you mend it," David nodded, "and in return, you'll have a home here." She looked down, her hands folded. "A home," she repeated, the word heavy on her tongue, as though it was something rare, something long lost. That night, David woke to a sound. He stepped out of the house and saw faint light coming from the barn. Curiosity pulled him closer, peering through a crack. He saw the widows gathered in a circle, a small flame flickering in the center. They were not praying, not exactly. Their voices rose and fell in a rhythm, a song of grief, one by one. They spoke words he did not understand, but their faces told the story. Sorrow carved deep into every line. Suddenly, the youngest widow began to cry, her small frame shaking. Lyra placed a hand on her shoulder, whispering to calm her. David could not hear the words, but he felt the pain. It was a mourning ritual. He realized then these women were not only workers or survivors. They were widows carrying the ghosts of lost husbands, families, and homes. David stepped back quietly, not wanting to intrude, but his heart felt heavier. He understood why they worked with such desperate energy. Every fence repaired, every seed planted, it was not just for survival. It was their way of holding on, of fighting against the emptiness that followed them. The next morning, David confronted Lyra gently. "I heard your voices last night," he said. His eyes searched hers. "You've lost much, haven't you?" For a long moment, she said nothing. Finally, she sighed. "The war took everything." Her voice trembled, but did not break. "Our husbands fought, our children gone. Our world turned to ash. Those of us left were hunted, scattered like dust." Her words pierced him. He had known loneliness, but this was a wound deeper than anything he could imagine. 5 women carrying the weight of a whole people's end. "They call us cursed," she whispered, her eyes distant. "Widows of the fallen. Unwanted even by our own kind. So we wandered until your post." She looked at him then, her eyes shining in the morning light. "Until you," David felt a chill. He had not planned any of this. He was just a farmer looking for help. Yet fate had placed these women in his care. From that day, he saw them differently. Not only as workers, but as survivors of something far greater than himself. And with that understanding came a quiet responsibility. He could no longer think of sending them away. But shadows were not only in their past, they lingered in the present. At the edge of the farm, David began to notice signs he could not explain: broken branches where no storm had passed, footprints too large for human boots. One evening, as he walked back from the fields, he saw movement in the distance, a figure standing at the tree line, watching. Before he could shout, it vanished into the forest. The air grew cold around him. When he told Lyra, her face went pale. The other widows exchanged fearful glances. The smallest one whispered a single word in their language, a word that made them all shiver. The hunters. Lyra finally said, her voice low, "They track us. They never stop if they find us here." She did not finish. David's stomach turned. His quiet farm was no longer just his. It was now a sanctuary, and sanctuaries always drew enemies. That night, as the widows huddled together in fear, David sat alone on the porch, his shotgun resting. Across his knees, the stars above looked colder than ever. He realized the truth: his life would never be simple again. He was no longer just a lonely farmer. He was a protector, whether he was ready or not. The farm no longer felt safe. David still worked the fields, still repaired fences and fed animals, but now his eyes were always drawn to the tree line. Every shadow seemed longer, every sound sharper. It was as if the land itself was warning him that danger was near. The widows tried to carry on, but even in their silence, David noticed the change. Their movements were tense, their eyes often scanning the horizon. The youngest, who once sang softly while tending the animals, now spoke little. Her small hands shook whenever a branch snapped in the distance. One morning, David found strange prints in the soil near the barn. They were wide, heavy, not made by human boots. The marks were deep, as though the creature that left them carried great weight. He crouched down, his fingers brushing the soil. His stomach turned cold. These were not the prints of any animal he knew, he told Lyra at once. She stared at the ground, her face pale. The others gathered around, whispering in their strange tongue. Finally, Lyra looked up at him, her silver hair glinting in the sunlight. "They are close," she whispered, "the hunters." David swallowed hard. He had heard the word before, but now it pressed on him like a heavy stone. "Who are they?" he asked. Her voice was low, trembling. "They are the ones who follow us. They kill the widows, erase us from the stars. To them, we are nothing but reminders of failure. They will not stop until we are gone." The other women lowered their heads, as though in shame. Their silence was heavy. David looked at them, at the tired faces, the haunted eyes. He clenched his fists. "This is my land," he said. "If they come here, they'll regret it." But even as he spoke, fear gnawed at his heart. What could one farmer with a shotgun do against trained hunters from the stars? That night he could not sleep. He sat on the porch with his lantern, staring into the dark fields. His ears caught every rustle of grass, every cry of a night bird behind him. The barn glowed faintly with the warmth of the widow's fire. He thought of their whispered songs, their grief, their quiet strength. And he made a choice. The next day, David began to prepare. He repaired the fences with stronger wood, not just to keep animals in, but to slow intruders. He placed old iron traps along hidden paths. He sharpened tools that had long gathered dust. His hands, calloused from years of farming, now worked with the determination of a soldier. The widows watched. At first, they said nothing. But slowly, they began to help. One showed him how to strengthen the barn doors with alien knots. Another taught him how to use a strange powder they carried to mask their scent. The smallest widow, though frightened, placed small stones along the pathways. whispering words over them David did not understand, but he felt the ground hum beneath his boots. Lyra stayed by his side. She spoke of the hunters' ways, how they tracked silently, how they struck without warning. Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed fear. David realized she was not only their leader, but their shield, and now she trusted him to share the weight. One evening, as the sun dipped low, David walked the farm's edge. He saw it again, a figure at the tree line, tall, still, watching. The moment his eyes fixed on it, the figure melted into the shadows, leaving only the whisper of wind. When he returned, Lyra was waiting. Her face was pale. "They know," she said. "They are testing you. They are waiting." David felt his jaw tighten. The farm, his quiet home, had become a battlefield in waiting. He glanced at the widows, their faces lit by the orange glow of the barn fire. He saw not just fear, but something else, a desperate hope. They had chosen to stay here with him, despite the danger. That night, he gathered them inside the farmhouse. His voice was rough, but steady. "Listen," he said. "I don't know what these hunters want. I don't know how many of them there are, but I do know this: this land is mine, and you are under my roof. No one takes what's mine, not without a fight." The widows exchanged glances. The smallest one trembled, but Lyra stepped forward. Her silver hair shone like steel in the firelight. "Then we stand with you," she said. Her voice carried the strength of all five. It was an unspoken pact, sealed not by words alone, but by the look in their eyes. For the first time, David realized he was no longer standing alone against the darkness. Still, the fear never left. The nights grew longer, colder. The whispers of the forest seemed closer. The hunters were near. David could feel it in his bones. He lay awake, his shotgun by his side, knowing the storm was coming. The farm that once held only silence now held lives, hopes, and the promise of battle. And somewhere in the shadows, the hunters waited, watching, preparing to strike. The night came heavy and silent. The moon hung low, casting silver light over the fields. David sat on the porch, his shotgun resting across his knees. The widows stayed close together in the barn, their eyes wide and restless. Everyone felt if the air itself was too still, as if holding its breath before a storm. Then it began. A sharp crack echoed from the woods, a branch snapping under weight not meant for this world. David stood at once, his hand gripping the shotgun. He stared at the tree line, shadows moving like dark waves between the trunks. The hunters had arrived. From the barn, Lyra stepped out. Her silver hair catching the moonlight, she carried nothing but her steady gaze. The others followed, each with simple tools: an axe, a hammer, a sharp piece of metal. They had no weapons of war, but their eyes were fierce. Shapes emerged from the trees, tall and armored. Their bodies glowed faintly under the moon, their faces hidden behind masks of steel. They carried long blades that shimmered like liquid fire. Hunters, one of them stepped forward, his voice deep and cruel. "Widows," he growled, "you do not belong here." His eyes flicked to David, and his tone dripped with disdain. "And you, human farmer, you protect what is already lost." David raised his shotgun, his voice firm. "This is my land," he said. "You step 1 foot closer, you'll regret it." The hunter laughed, a sound like grinding metal. Then, with sudden speed, they charged. The farm erupted into chaos. David fired the shotgun, the blast echoing across the fields. One hunter staggered back, armor dented but not fallen. The widows rushed forward, their movements desperate but skilled. Lyra swung her axe against a hunter's blade, sparks flying. Another widow leaped onto the back of an enemy. Striking with all her strength, David's traps came alive. A hidden rope snapped, pulling one hunter off his feet. Iron teeth clamped shut on another's leg, making him roar in fury. The animals panicked, but their cries masked the sound of more shots as David reloaded and fired again. The smallest widow knelt by the soil, whispering words into the earth. The ground trembled. Loose stones rolling. A hunter stumbled as the dirt beneath him shifted like water. David stared in disbelief, but there was no time to ask. The fight was brutal. Hunters outnumbered them, but David knew the land. He ducked behind fences, using shadows to his advantage. He fired, reloaded, fired again. The recoil bruised his shoulder, but he ignored the pain. Every shot was to protect the women who had placed their trust in him. One widow was thrown to the ground. A hunter's blade raised above her. David shouted and fired. The blast tore through the hunter's mask, dropping him with a crash. The woman scrambled to her feet, her eyes locking on David, gratitude flashing through her fear. Still, more hunters poured from the woods. The air burned with their strange weapons, flames licking at the barn walls. David's heart sank. If the barn burned, they would lose everything. Water. He shouted. The widows moved quickly, forming a line with buckets from the well. Their hands worked with desperate rhythm, fighting fire as well as enemies. Lyra stood beside David, swinging her axe again and again. Her face was fierce, sweat and ash mixing with her silver hair. She shouted something in her language. The widows answered. Their voices rose together, not in fear, but in defiance. For a moment, David felt if the farm was no longer just his, it was theirs, and they fought. As one, the battle stretched deep into the night. The ground was torn, the fences broken again, the air thick with smoke. But slowly, through grit and fire, the hunters began to fall. David's traps claimed some, his shotgun claimed others. The widows, though wounded and weary, never backed down. At last, silence returned. The final hunter fell with a crash, his blade slipping from his hands. The widows stood over the bodies, their chests heaving, their clothes torn. David lowered his shotgun, his arms heavy. His farm was scarred, but still standing. The widows gathered near the barn, their faces pale in the moonlight. Lyra looked at David, her voice steady but soft. "You fought with us," she said. "You stood when others would run." David wiped the sweat from his brow, his chest rising with slow breaths. "You're under my roof," he said. "That means your family now, and no one hurts my family." The widows bowed their heads, and for the first time, David saw not just sorrow in their eyes, but pride. They were no longer only widows, no longer only survivors. Tonight, they were defenders. The night grew quiet again, but the silence was different. It carried the weight of victory and the shadow of what might come next. David looked at the broken fences, the scorched barn, the fallen hunters. He knew this was only the beginning. The hunters would return, stronger, but so would he. And now he was no longer alone. The battle had ended. But the farm bore the scars of war. The fences lay broken, the soil was torn, and smoke still curled from the barn roof. David walked slowly across the field, his boots sinking into mud stained by both blood and ash. His shotgun hung heavy in his hands, but it was no longer needed. The night was quiet again, only the crackle of dying flames remained. The widows stood together, their clothes torn, their faces marked with dirt and sweat. They were exhausted, yet still standing. Their eyes turned to David, not with fear, but with something different, trust. For the first time, he saw pride in their gaze. Lyra approached him, her silver hair streaked with soot. Her voice was low but steady. "You fought with us," she said, "not as a farmer, not as an outsider, but as one of us." She looked back at the others, then returned her gaze to him. "We are still alive because of you." David shook his head. "We're alive because of each other," he said. "I couldn't have done this alone." His words were simple, but they carried the truth. The widows bowed their heads. A silent agreement passed between them. They were no longer strangers hiding in his barn. They were family now, tied not by blood, but by survival. Over the next days, the farm became a place of rebuilding. David and the widows worked side by side, repairing what had been broken. They raised the fences higher, stronger than before. They patched the barn walls with new wood. They cleared the fields of scorched earth, planting new seeds with careful hands. But something else began to grow. It was not only crops or walls, it was a sense of belonging. The widows sang softly while they worked, their voices weaving through the air like threads of light. David listened, not understanding the words, but feeling the strength in them. The farm, once a place of silence and loneliness, now pulsed. With life at night, they gathered around the fire. David told stories of his childhood on the farm, of his father teaching him how to plow the land. Of the old festivals in the town, the widows listened, their eyes wide. Some shared pieces of their own past, fragments of homes now gone. Of children's laughter silenced by war. Though their voices trembled, they spoke. And David listened with respect. One evening, the smallest widow approached David. Her hands clutched a tiny carving made of bone. She pressed it into his palm, her eyes shining. "For you," she whispered. Her words were broken, but her meaning clear. It was a gift, a piece of their lost world offered to him. David closed his hand around it, his throat tight. The farm was no longer just a farm. It was becoming something more. A sanctuary, a place where the widows could lay down their grief, even if only for a while, a place where David, once alone, found purpose again. News began to spread quietly. Though David never understood how, one morning he noticed movement by the road. A small group of figures stood there, thin, cloaked, carrying the same weary look as the widows had when they first arrived. Survivors, the widows welcomed them, guiding them to the barn. David watched as his land, once empty, began to fill with life. More hands worked the fields. More voices joined the songs at night. The farm grew stronger, not weaker, with every new soul that stepped onto it. David stood one evening on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields. The land glowed with fresh green shoots. The fences stood tall. The barn was whole again. Behind him, laughter drifted from the fire, alien and human voices blending together. For the first time in many years, he smiled without sadness. Lyra joined him, standing at his side. "This place," she said, her voice soft. "It is no longer just your farm. It is ours too." David nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "It's a sanctuary," he said. The word felt right, and it stayed with him, but even as warmth filled the air, shadows still lingered in his thoughts. The hunters had been defeated, but not destroyed. They would return, stronger, more determined, yet David felt no fear. He looked at the widows, at the others who had joined, and he knew they would not stand alone. The sanctuary was born not from peace, but from battle, not from wealth, but from survival. And though danger still waited beyond the fields, inside these fences there was life. There was hope. That night, as the stars filled the sky, David sat by the fire, the widows around him, their faces lit with soft light. He realized the farm had given him something he had thought lost forever. It had given him a family, and deep in his heart, he knew he would fight to protect it, no matter what came. The weeks passed, and the farm changed in ways David could hardly believe. What was once quiet land with broken fences and empty fields had turned into a place of life. The crops grew tall and green. The animals thrived, and the air carried the sound of work, laughter, and songs, both human and alien. Every morning began the same. The widows rose before dawn, lighting fires, preparing food, and tending to the animals. David joined them, his boots muddy, his shirt damp with sweat. Together they worked as one. There were no longer helpers. or strangers, they had become a family. Each one tied to the other by survival and care. David noticed changes in the women, too. When they had first arrived, their faces were shadowed with grief, their voices carried sorrow, their eyes held fear. Now, though the pain never fully left, there was light. They smiled more. Their laughter came easier. Even the youngest widow, once trembling at every sound, now walked the fields with confidence, humming soft songs to the soil. One evening, after a long day, David sat on the porch, watching the widows near the barn. They were weaving something from old rope and cloth, their hands quick and skilled. He asked what it was, and Lyra answered with a small smile. "A banner," she said. "Every sanctuary must have a sign." When? They hung it on the barn wall. David stared at it for a long time. It was simple, rough in its stitching, but it carried symbols from their lost world. Mixed with shapes, David recognized crops, animals, even the outline of a small farmhouse. It was their way of saying this place was not only his, it was theirs too. Life found rhythm at night. They gathered around the fire, telling stories. David shared tales of harvest festivals, of his parents, and the old ways of farming. The widows shared fragments of their lives, stories of children who once played beneath alien skies, of villages filled with music, of battles that took everything from them. Sometimes their voices broke, but around the fire, they were safe enough to remember. And then one night, as the flames danced high, something new appeared in the sky. A streak of silver light moved across the darkness. Growing larger, it was not a star, not a shooting comet. It was a ship. The widows saw it first, their faces turning pale. Lyra's hands tightened into fists. The smallest widow whispered a single word, fear trembling in her voice. David's chest grew heavy. He reached for his shotgun, but Lyra placed a hand on his arm. "Not tonight," she said. Her voice was steady. "They watch, but they do not strike. Not yet." The ship moved slowly, circling once before vanishing into the clouds. The fire crackled louder in the silence that followed. The widows huddled close, their eyes wide. David stared at the empty sky, his jaw set. He knew then that their sanctuary would always carry risk. The hunters had not forgotten, and they would return. But fear did not crush him. Instead, it hardened into resolve. He looked at the women beside him, at their tired faces lit by firelight, at the quiet strength in their eyes. They were no longer alone, and neither was he. In the days that followed, the farm prepared quietly. Stronger fences, deeper wells, hidden storage of food and tools. They trained together, not as soldiers, but as protectors. David taught them how to aim his old rifle. They taught him how to listen to the ground, how to read signs in the wind. Their worlds blended, and in that blending grew something powerful. One evening, Lyra stood beside David on the porch. The field stretched wide before them, the crops swaying gently in the wind. "You gave us more than food and shelter," she said softly. "You gave us a place to belong." David looked at her, his eyes steady. "And you gave me something I thought I'd never have again," he said. His voice lowered, almost breaking. "A family." The word hung in the air, carrying weight and truth. Lyra lowered her head, a faint smile touching her lips. For a moment, the grief in her eyes softened. That night, laughter filled the farm. Alien songs mixed with David's old farm tunes. The children of survivors who had joined played near the barns, chasing each other under the starlight. The farm, once lonely and broken, had become a living sanctuary. But beyond the fences, the world was not done with them. The hunters would come again. The ship in the sky was only the beginning. Yet inside the sanctuary, there was no fear, only readiness. They would face what came together. As one, as David lay down to rest, the sounds of life echoing through the farmhouse, he felt something he had not felt in years. Peace, not the peace of silence or loneliness, but the peace of belonging. He closed his eyes, knowing tomorrow would bring work, laughter, and perhaps danger. But he would not face it alone. The farmer, who had once posted a simple notice for help, had found more than workers. He had found a family, a purpose, and a sanctuary worth defending.